Good morning, everybody. I'm here today to have an extremely important conversation with Dr. André Corrêa de Almeida, who is a professor, political economist, social entrepreneur, and author, with academic, management, and leadership experience all over the world. He has notable strengths, which include the ability to organize collaborative platforms in very complex and ambiguous environments. He is assistant director and adjunct associate professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. He researches how city governments innovate, how innovations occur from within the public structure. And he wrote a book about it, Smarter New York City, How City Agencies Innovate. But he focuses on research for change. Therefore, his research includes the topic of systemic corruption and its intersection with cities and their innovation opportunities. Dr. Almeida.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Planetiers World Gathering. And the topic I would like to discuss today is the tension between the very large number of opportunities for innovation from within city administrations and the underlying systemic corruption that so many of our public systems face. But let's start with the basics. It should not be a surprise to anyone that populations are people, citizens, communities are moving from the urban environment, from the rural environment to the urban environment, as illustrated by this slide. By 2050, 2/3 of the world population are expected to live in urban settings, and the reasons for that, there are many reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that cities have an intrinsic set of competitive advantages that makes them very attractive for people to fulfill their needs, economic needs, social needs, connectivity needs, entrepreneurial needs. As illustrated by this chart, the larger is the percentages of the urban population in countries, the larger is income and wealth in that particular country. So the positive correlation between the size of urban share population and GDP per capita. So not surprisingly, cities around the world and cities of all sizes are growing in number, and notably the slices on the top, which are the so-called mega cities, cities with more than 10 million inhabitants, are the cities that are growing faster, almost doubling in 2030 what we had in 2014. So these are very basic numbers to put things into perspective. People keep moving from the rural areas to urban cities, to urban environments, and the size of the cities are growing naturally, and particularly the size of the largest cities are going faster, and that is what, and that creates what I call as a first order problem. As illustrated in this slide, not only the overall population in the urban setting is increasing, as illustrated by these two portions in green, but also as illustrated by the upper portion, urban slum population is increasing, which highlights the inequality issues that cities are facing. So yes, it's true, on average we are all better off, as illustrated by this slide, but inequalities across cities are becoming much more complex. The problem is not only about inequality within cities. The problem is that there's a growing competition between cities. As illustrated in this chart, we see that large and medium-sized cities are capturing most of the employment creation, at least measured between 2008 and 2017. So the demographic mobility from rural areas to urban areas is not only creating tensions within the city boundaries, but also between cities, as illustrated by this chart. Smaller cities, mid-sized cities, smaller and suburban areas are having an increasing difficulty to attract employment, skilled labor, etc. So two highlights or two main conclusions or two main thoughts out of this set of initial findings is that there are incredible opportunities for cities to become innovation agents, because there's not only the demand for better services, as illustrated by the growing mobility of people from rural areas to urban areas, but because there's an increasing complexity of issues around the wealth creation, around energy consumption, around greenhouse emissions, and around transportation issues. So I just want to highlight that what could be viewed as a tremendous pressures for city administrations are indeed incredible opportunities that could be used to propel development across the globe. And not surprisingly, the demand for efficiencies and enhanced performance is continual because populations are moving to cities and populations are becoming better educated and better equipped to advocate for their own aspirations and rights. There's a growing demand for improvement of the quality of life in cities. But the problem is, and that's why I highlighted this particular line here, is that to a large extent, municipalities and city administrations around the world are bankrupt. So one of the things that I want to highlight in this presentation today is, on one hand, the incredible opportunities that we find in cities and city agencies. In Portuguese, the expression would be variações, to foster innovation locally. And we even have an SDG that it's about global partnerships. And I'm fascinated by the fact that in 2015, this SDG dedicated to global partnerships was left for last, quote unquote. The 17th SDG is about global partnerships. This is for me, and as you, Alexandra, so kindly mentioned, someone that spends his life trying to find ways of bringing stakeholders together and creating win-win situations and better public-private partnerships. It's very reinforcing and very encouraging to realize that the SDG seems to suggest that no matter the state of research and practice and development in all other 16 goals in terms of oceans, environment, health, food, nutrition, etc., if you don't come up with the global partnerships to propel, to move those sectoral areas forward, very little will happen. So once again, cities have in this 17 SDG a phenomenal space and a phenomenal framework to foster that development. But now, 3 challenges, and then I stop and we can open up for a conversation. 3 challenges that we have here. Let's look at the 3 fields of research: public administration, okay? One field typically associated with the research and practice in the public space, and then business and management, typically associated with research and work in the private sector. And look how much the number of journals vary and the number of citations. In the public, in the private sector research, typically built from the MBA tradition, we have 3 times and 4.5 times more magazines and reviews being published than in public administration studies. And look at the number of citations. 10 times more citations in fields that are typically associated with the research on the private sector. And what are the keywords that we find in these papers? On the left-hand side, we have words such as corruption, lack of capacity. These are keywords found in the literature on public administration. And on the right-hand side, we have keywords found in the literature regarding the research and innovation in the private sector. Startups, large companies, Silicon Valleys, innovation hubs. So a very critical issue we have is that perceptions are incredibly biased towards the private sector and against the public sector in terms of understanding the potential for innovation from within the public structures. Challenge number one, issue of trust and perceptions. Challenge number two, and this is a story that happened in Silicon Valley in a conference I attended in 2017. I'm attending a conference on smart cities, and during lunchtime I pick up my place, I look for a table, and I found a table. This was a standing lunch, and I found a table. I approached these two gentlemen that were in the table, and I had my Columbia University badge, and I didn't know who these two gentlemen were. And as I approached the table, they say, this is a conference on smart cities, they say, we are not smart yet. And I was just looking for a spot to put my place and have a nice conversation. So these two gentlemen were representatives of mid-sized towns in North America. And they were incredibly embarrassed or very uncomfortable to have a conversation about innovation. And why is that? Because to a very large extent, conversations around innovation are about tech and data. And if you focus a conversation about innovation on tech and data, you lose 9 out of 10 mayors in the room, because they simply do not have the financial capacity to purchase the science fiction, futuristic visions that smart city discourse allows. And so our research focus on understanding innovation much beyond the tech and data aspect. And we talk about the organizational culture, we think about the leadership skills, we think about the existing institutional framework in place, we think about the existing networks in place. Basically, we think about the already existing forces that can help city mayors and municipalities build innovation agendas without the problem of focusing on tech and data, because there's a very few number of cities around the world, New York being one of them, maybe Lisbon, maybe Cascais, Tokyo, Paris, Stockholm, Barcelona, but those are not the cities around the world that are facing most of the development issues that we're trying to address. And we did study the case of New York. We don't have time to go into the details of this slide, but very quickly, each quadrant represents a stage in the innovation process. Problem definition, how cities define the problem, how city agencies then design an intervention, how city agencies then actually implement an intervention, and then how city agencies assess. This is part of our Smarter New York City book that came out in 2018. And look how the different forces interact throughout these different phases. So as a living, as a proof, as evidence that are incredible opportunities and incredible forces happening within the city agencies to foster innovation locally. But again, and I don't want to, we don't have, I don't want to go back, but I did go back to this slide to again once reinforce, reiterate the idea of our perceptions are so, in our understanding, unfair and not accurate vis-a-vis what's really happening within city departments, city units, city agencies. And finally, the third problem, and then I'll stop here. The third problem that I would like to highlight in this presentation today is the issue of power distribution across national jurisdictions and corruption. And this is the only slides that I'm going to focus on Portugal. Before we talked about New York, now we're going to talk about Portugal. The percentage of total national general revenue collected at the local level in Portugal is half of what's collected in the European Union, which means that local authorities, typically municipalities and cities, have a very limited financial autonomy vis-a-vis the central government. This is not really a surprise for the Portuguese, because we know how dependent we are, the entire national system, on the national budget and on the decisions coming from the São Bento and the Parliament. But what this means is that local authorities, cities typically in Portugal, in the case of Portugal, since we don't have a mid-level jurisdiction as the US has, the state level, we become very vulnerable to issues of corruption that happens at the national level. And in 2015, for example, Paul Morais estimated that just based on the number of corruption cases identified, the total waste of the public wealth and public funds was equivalent to 30% of the national public debt. 30% of the national public debt. In 2018, another study showed that the amount of corruption was more or less equivalent to more than 1.2 times more than the total budget available for the national health system. So when you have these two factors, amount of waste of financial resources through corruption and a very low degree of autonomy at local level, you can see the tension, the downward tension at the local of penalizing the capacity of local government to innovate through the scarcity, of course, of funds. In 2017, in 2019, not surprisingly, by the way, in 2019, recently, the Corruption Perception Index shows that Portugal dropped from the 23rd place in 2010 to the 30th place in 2019. So in 20 years, so not only we have a corruption issue, which by the way is an issue that happens all over the world, so it's not specific of Portugal, but what happens in Portugal in relation to the case that we are discussing today is that on one hand there's incredible potential for innovation within city structures, but then undermined with the issue of corruption. And not surprisingly, and this is the last slide, look the correlation, not necessarily causation, the correlation between levels of corruption perception. So the darker the color, the higher the perceptions rate. So you see, so a sort of the more you move to northeast, the lower the perceptions of corruption, with the level of, as measured by the Smart Sustainable City Rank scores, the level of smartness, urban smartness or city smartness. So the two lines go in parallel, which even though I'm not suggesting causation, there's a very clear correlation between transparency, integrity, and the capacity of cities and local levels to apply resources in a smarter way, in a more sustainable way. So I guess the call of my, and mixing a little bit my research background with my civic engagement background, the call and the hope is that we can all free our countries from corruption. And just to put it very clearly, I mentioned the case of Portugal because it's a country that I love, not because it's the only country where we have this problem.
André, this is truly fascinating. Corruption is all over the world. I chose Portugal to live, and I love this country. And we all read on the news that the central government really wants to foster the development of the interior of Portugal. I've traveled a lot around Portugal, cities, 60,000, 100,000, 200,000 people. Mostly there's excellent universities around there, so there's a capacity. And I guess you're totally right. I mean, instead of focusing on the technical and the expensive things that Silicon Valley can afford, the structural issues need to be resolved first. So what is your take on what is happening in these municipalities in Portugal to be able to get out of this inertia and start moving?
Well, thank you for the question, because as I was building the Smarter New York City project in New York, I was in parallel with the Catholic University in Lisbon building a smarter PT project as well, precisely to highlight the incredible work that is being done in cities. And we studied with my colleagues at the Catholic University in Lisbon, we studied Lisboa, we studied Cascais, we studied Fundão, and there are other cities that joined the coalition to understand better how innovation is happening. And miracles are happening. So Portugal is in fact a case where, in spite of the issues that I outline and I feature in my presentation, cities are maybe not completely uniformly across, interior and the ocean area, are striving, as actually illustrated in one of my slides. The wealth, the average wealth of cities expand as the number of people, as cities expand in demographic terms. So I argue that even though Portugal is a country that faces tremendous financial constraints, cities across the country are doing a phenomenal work. The point that I want to highlight is how much more could we be doing? How much more could we be doing if the country was not facing? There are some financial issues that result from the external markets and the global circumstances. What I want to highlight is that there's a lot that we can do in terms of transparency, in terms of, for example, just a very specific example. How would you explain? This happened last week, early this week. Today's Friday, so early this week. How would you explain that the Parliament rejected a proposal to build an open data online platform to foster and to promote transparency and accountability regarding the European Union funds that are coming in to help us all address the COVID-19 issue? How is that explainable? It is not so much that the proposal was rejected, it's that there's no alternative. Those that rejected the proposal should have proposed an alternative. And that's one of the difficulties in the national budgeting process that we are now going through, by the way, is that it's very easy for the opposition, and opposition here does not mean government and opposition. It's very easy for those who do not agree with certain measures and proposals to reject them, but very rarely we have a plan B. So this was a long answer, but you travel around the country. I do as well, and generally speaking, living conditions in cities in Portugal are wonderful. The question is always, what's our benchmark? What is our horizon? What's our idealized future?
Yes. I also see some movement happening in trying to bring the younger generation back to the smaller cities and into agriculture, because nobody wants to be in agriculture anymore. And there's so much opportunity there. Also, another aspect is, it just crossed my mind. Yes, this is a huge problem you just described, lack of transparency. We have to do something about it. And I don't see a lot of advocacy happening. Because why couldn't there be a Greta Thunberg of transparency?
Wow. We should organize another Planetiers World Gathering just to talk about civic engagement and just to talk about civil society. But that's a great opportunity, and I'm in love with the 17 SDGs, the 17th SDG around global partnerships. And it's true that Portugal, compared with other countries, have a very limited tradition in terms of civil society. This is a fact. It's not even a critique. It's also true that Portugal, the democracy in Portugal, is in historical terms and in political science terms a very recent experience. Revolution in 74, 46 years ago, first constitution in 76, 44 years ago. But I think the tide is turning. I feel that there's more engagement. Until 2015, there were, until very recently, there were only 7 parties in the parliament. And with the most recent elections, we moved from 7 parties in the parliament to 10 parties in the parliament. Some may question the value and the ethics of certain parties, but it's unquestionable that there's a larger participation. We are moving beyond the political elite that came out of the 25 de Abril. So that's a good sign. But in relation to my Liberte o meu país da corrupção, or Free My Country from Corruption initiative, the second element, I talk about 2 ideas. The second one is precisely that we need to address civic resilience to engage. And this is not really done by design, it will take time. But we are all invited. We all should feel empowered to voice our aspirations and our critiques and our opinions. And so that's one of the critiques, or if you want to see it on the positive side, what are my calls? Portuguese people need to move. There are wonderful groups. For example, the Transparência e Integridade Portugal is a phenomenal group. They have 10 years, and there are the researchers and groups that work and try to change things, but it's not a collective experience. And the first issue, and I would like to make this again very clear, my main issue is not about corruption per se. Corruption happens around the world, and corruption will continue to happen. My main issue is the inertia of the legislator not to adopt recommendations that are very well known, both coming up from the national experts and international experts. So if you put the first and the second together, is the issue of the legislator and the Portuguese civil society have one thing in common, at least, is very low propensity to mobilize and move forward.
Yes, I think maybe my generation, I see the young generation in Portugal. No, there's a sparkle in their eyes.
Absolutely.
And I think there's got to be one leader that says, okay, let's go. And though you deal with young people and universities, and I think it's got to come from there, because I think it's the only way to engage, and the legislators have to listen. If there's a big group of people asking, demanding something, then it might happen.
I think it's changing. Mm-hmm. And I always have a very optimistic perspective, and I always embrace the historical and the longitudinal aspects of change. We have to be firm and rigorous in our research and in our advocacy for change, but we also have to be humble and parsimonious. Things take time, and I'm a person that is happy if I see change, even if it's slow and incremental. And that's what I hope that will continue to happen in Portugal, in the European Union in general, and in cities around the world, because that's where we'll all be living very soon.
Dr. Almeida, unfortunately our time is up. Thank you very much for bringing such bright ideas and knowledge to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.